and we were recapping things like music, the changes in terms of rock and roll, and how parents hate it, kids love it. We mentioned television and how that changes as a medium, and we'll be looking at some articles this week about TV and the music and the literature of the time. And speaking of the literature, I want to walk you through this video just the some of the more important books of the time period. And there are a lot of what you would call mainstream writers, but we'll also talk about kind of a subculture of writers at the time too. Let's talk about our specific books that kind of highlight what the 1950s are all about. Undoubtedly, one of the most popular books then and still popular now, The Catcher in the Rye, which has nothing to do with baseball before somebody makes the comment. Yes, somebody would have done it. J.D. Salinger's novel is about a kid who is kind of an annoying kid, an annoying teenager who gets thrown out of private schools and always has all kinds of problems. And he kind of challenges authority. And not only that, but this particular character, Holden Caulfield, he swears, he drinks, and this book also talks about sex. And for adults at the time, it was a little bit much. They were terrified of a particular book that would challenge authority and have kids basically trying to tell adults what to do. Little did they know that the decade we live in now, I can't imagine how the adults from the 1950s would rationalize it. But Catcher in Rye would be right up your all's alley. Like I said, it's about challenging authority and coming to terms with the real world. And the phrase, the title of the book, and you're going to see an excerpt from it this week. The main character realizes that the world is perhaps not everything that he thought it was. In fact, growing up and becoming an adult sucks. You realize how cruel the world can be at times, and as the main character Holden Caulfield says, everybody's a phony. And one of the things that he wants to do is protect his sister from having to grow up. And he says he wished that he could be in a giant field. And he said it's often like you're out in a field somewhere, and there's all kinds of crops growing up, and people can't see that you're about to go off the edge into oblivion. And that's what becoming an adult was like. And he said, I just want to be a catcher in the rye, someone who prevents the people from, accidentally falling over the ledge and becoming an adult. That, you know what, ignorance really is bliss. Incidentally, Catcher in the Rye is about something that we all deal with, and like I said, it's the struggle to become an adult and realize that the world is not quite as nice as we would think. All right, the next major book we want to talk about, something you guys have had to read at some point, Fahrenheit 451. It is a dystopian novel about a future where books are burned, and the firemen of the era are not putting out the fires, but they're conducting book burning. And anybody caught with a book, it's going to lead us down a terrible path. And what's interesting about Fahrenheit 451, it predicts a lot of interesting things about the future. We don't burn books now, obviously, but at the same time, Fahrenheit 451 was warning us about a future where people ignore books, where media kind of satiates us. And if you have read this book and you remember, there's a segment where they talk about the amount of or excuse me, the number of people who just watch all the news and the goings on of the world on giant screens, and it kind of pacifies them and makes them into almost kind of zombies. And nobody seems to be aware that they're missing out by not reading. Ah, some of you all don't like this, but it's such a classic. Okay, let's go to our next one here, On the Beach. This one about the threat of nuclear war, which we will talk about becoming more and more apparent as time goes on. And Neville Shute's novel, On the Beach, is about what happens when a nuclear war occurs, and the remnants of humanity are kind of confined to Australia, of all places. And It's a really good book about how people spend the days after a kind of a worldwide apocalypse. And spoiler alert, everybody dies at the end. No, really, everybody dies at the end. That's part of the point to say that that nuclear war will ultimately destroy us all. That China, the Soviet Union, the United States, all the great nuclear powers, all they'll end up doing is just destroying one another. They even came up with a political term for it back in the day: mutually assured destruction. MAD. The idea that if one nation has nuclear weapons, the others, could retaliate with equal force. Our next book. This is from a guy named Jack Kerouac, and Jack Kerouac and some of his boys were known as the beat writers. They called themselves the beat writers because they felt like society, mainstream society, had beat them down, that they didn't want to conform to what the world set out for them. They didn't want to live in this cookie cutter 1950s lifestyle where everybody was a company man wearing a suit to work, living out in the suburbs. That's not their style. Jack Kerouac and some of his friends literally take a road trip out west, and Kerouac's story here, his book On the Road, is about that trip out west, and it talks about their use of alcohol, their use of drugs, some sexual escapades, things that adults don't want their kids reading. And in the 1950s, remember the stereotypical society or the standards that quote unquote normal people had to comply with did not include these things. They didn't want young people reading about drinking and drugs and sex. That was off limits. These books, in fact, On the Beach, not necessarily in there, and Fahrenheit 451, not either, but On the Road and Catcher in the Rye, both books that, in many instances, found themselves on banned book lists that the adults in particular school districts did not want kids reading. Let's move forward and talk about The Feminine Mystique. One of the most important books in defining women. Betty Friedan's book wasn't published until 1963, but she compiled the information about women in the 1950s, and she had written about what women in the 1950s were struggling with, and that was coming up with an identity of their own. Friedan's premise of her book was that uh, women women mainly got their identity through their husband and their children, by being, a homemaker and a mom, uh, and ultimately that identity wouldn't last though because kids grow up and move out, husbands retire and do their own thing, and they have fun with their friends. What does that leave women to do? And Betty Friedan said women are looking for an identity all their own. And she's right. Women in the 1950s, and we'll see more so in the 1960s, women are looking to create their own identity. What does it mean to be a woman? What is it that's going to define my life and my existence? Women start to realize you can do more with your life than just be a housewife and a mother. The book also wrangled a lot of people who were not in step with Betty Friedan's ideas on feminism and what women should and could do. Right. Finally, we have perhaps the weirdest books. Two volumes here by Alfred Kinsey. You can see his name on the list. Alfred Kinsey was a social scientist who studied sexual behavior in both men and women. And these books, he interviewed a large number of people and surveyed them about their sexual habits. All right. And Alfred Kinsey's conclusions are pretty concerning, especially for the time period. Alfred Kinsey comes to the conclusion that sexuality isn't what we think. A lot of people thought that sexuality, you were either heterosexual or homosexual, and that was it. It was a binary type of thing. But Alfred Kinsey suggests something completely different. He said people are actually on a scale from like 0 to 6. And he said that, you can be Like he said, people reported, they may have relationships. Like a man may decide that he's only going to have relationships with women, and a woman might decide she'll only have relationships with men. But they admitted to sexual experimentation with people of the same sex. And Alfred Kinsey said, maybe people are on a spectrum, that they're more, like if 0 being completely heterosexual and 5 was completely homosexual and 6 was what he considered asexual, meaning they just weren't interested in sex or relationships with anyone at all. And Kinsey said, not many people are actually on one end or the other. Most people are somewhere in the middle. And this definitely caused people to be extremely uncomfortable with Kinsey's conclusions. Because, of course, nobody at the time wanted to ever admit that they could have been on a spectrum somewhere. They're like, well, we're completely heterosexual. And anybody who says otherwise, they're wrong. Right? Now, a lot of people derided Kinsey and said that, he was a quack and they didn't know what he was talking about and they dismissed him. But the scientific community, not so much. And strangely enough, this is the kind of book that people said they didn't approve of, but his book sold more than 1 million copies, which tell you that somebody was reading it. Ultimately, Kinsey's work culminated in the University of Indiana opening up a school within its program that studies human sexuality, and they're still there today. Okay, so there you have it, folks. The literature of the generation. Those are the main books, and like I said, there are a ton of other books that help define the 1950s. But those are some of the ones that are significant in talking about challenging what we thought was normal and what we thought was good for society. Sexual behaviors. People say all of a sudden realize they're like, wow, maybe I'm more, maybe more people are like me than what I realize. The issues with women. Women obviously are struggling at the time, and Betty Friedan offers them a bit of a solution, saying you don't have to be this way. Catcher in the Rye, the same thing, that coming to terms with reality. All right. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, guys. Hope you're doing all right. This video is a little bit short, but that's the way we want to keep it for your spring break this week. There are still things we need to do, but at the same time, I'm not going to overwhelm you with stuff either.